As we continue with part 3 of lecture 7 and continuing with information processing under cognitive development, we just spoke about earlier in part 2 fuzzy trace theory and looked at verbatim memory trace and gist. So as we move on, let's turn our attention to under information processing, creative thinking and critical thinking. So although the developmental process is somewhat predictable, children vary in their rate of change. The number of dimensions along which children conceptualize other people grows through childhood. So the greatest increase in children's ability to distinguish people's characteristics really occur between 7 to 8 years of age. Children from ages 6 to 12 continue to acquire subtle phonological distinctions, vocabulary, semantics, syntaxes, formal discourse pattern, and complex aspects of pragmatics in their first language. So in terms of critical thinking, thinking that is reflectively and productively and in evaluating evidence. So critical thinking, thinking reflectively and productively and evaluating evidence. And the whole concept of mindfulness falls really under critical thinking. In terms of creative thinking, the ability to think in novel and unusual ways and to come up with unique solutions to problems. And there is a difference between creativity and intelligence. The difference is actually recognized by distinguishing between convergent and divergent thinking. So what really is divergent thinking versus convergent thinking? Convergent thinking is thinking that produces one correct answer and is characteristic of the kind of thinking tested by standardized tests, as in conventional tests, while divergent thinking produces many answers to the same question and is characteristic of creativity. So that brings us to the end of cognitive development, and our attention is now on socio-emotional development. And we're going to look at the work of Erikson. And for Erikson, the personality changes of the school years build on Freud's latency stage, and Erikson's psychosocial stage during childhood is industry versus inferiority, and it is the psychological conflict of middle childhood, which is resolved positively when experiences lead children to develop a sense of competence at useful skills and tasks. Children desire to try many new things and to develop their abilities. The danger at this stage is inferiority, which is reflected in the sad pessimism of children who have little confidence in their ability to do things well. And that is usually during the time where children engage in many academic related tests where they have to perform well. SEA is always on their mind, and those who are actually prevented from trying new activities do not get the opportunity to try. They do not experience success in comparison to the group and are likely to develop low self-esteem. So as we continue with understanding the self, the development of the self, during the school years, children develop a much more refined me, self, or self-concept, organizing their observations of behaviors and internal states into general dispositions. Children can describe themselves in terms of psychological traits, emphasizing competencies instead of specific behaviors. School children begin to make social comparisons in that they judge their appearances, their abilities, and behavior in relation to that of others. Cognitive, social, and cultural influences on self-concepts. Cognitive development affects the structure of self-concept, where school-age children show an improved ability to combine typical experiences and behaviors into stable psychological disposition. So the changing content of self-concept is actually a product of both cognitive capacities and the feedback these children will receive from others. So as we're on understanding the self, we have to understand how do these children really conceptualize and understand others. So children actually show an increase in perspective taking Remember, in early childhood, perspective taking was on a decrease, or they did not gain perspective taking skills as yet. And perspective taking is the ability to assume other people's perspectives and understand their thoughts and feelings. And that is really fully, to some extent, there seems to be an increase in perspective taking in middle and late childhood. Perspective taking is especially thought to be important in whether children develop pro-social or anti-social attitudes and behavior. With regard to pro-social behavior, taking another's perspective actually would improve children's likelihood of understanding and sympathizing with others when distressed or in need. In terms of antisocial, on the other hand, some researchers have found that children who have a low level of perspective-taking skills engage in more antisocial behavior than children at higher levels. Children also become increasingly skeptical of others' claims during that time. So I'm moving our attention a bit further, very specific, to self-concept and self-esteem. And these are the psychological constructs most typically employed in research and practice with school-age children, but they are not they should not be used interchangeably. Self-esteem refers to the judgment children make about their own worth. Self-esteem is an affective term. Self-esteem generally declines in middle childhood due to increased feedback from peers and school. Remember, I spoke about that feedback from others. Self-concept, on the other hand, is more of a cognitive construction, and self-concept comprises of your knowledge of who you are, and self-competence refers to what you can do. So self-competence, what you can do; self-concept, very cognitive in nature, your knowledge of who you are; and self-esteem, very affective in nature, in terms of your own self-worth and so on. So with high self-esteem, children work harder in school and artistic expression. They generally display greater prosocial behaviors, and culture actually plays an important, very influential role in self-esteem development. Research has shown that Asian children tend to have lower self-esteem than American children, more westernized versus more Eastern cultures. However, children with high self-esteem do not necessarily perform better in school. They have greater initiative, can be positive or negative. And one of the things you will see is that parenting styles can also influence self-esteem development. With parenting style, when you can look at it, which one do you think is most effective towards self-esteem development? Does optimal parenting style vary as a function of culture? And that's something you need to look at, whether self-esteem and what's the relationship between parenting style and self-esteem. Parenting style can vary as a function of culture. Is that true? Is that not true? Can you explain this? And that's something for you to consider. So when we look at the self, there are good strategies for effectively increasing a child's self-esteem, where you can identify the causes of low self-esteem. Intervention should target the causes of low self-esteem. Children should engage or be encouraged to identify and value areas of competence. We should provide some sort of emotional support and social approval. Children with low self-esteem may come from conflicted families or conditions in which they experienced abuse and neglect. Therefore, other alternative sources of support could be arranged either informally or through the encouragement of a teacher, coach, mentors, and so on. Third, you help the child achieve. Through achievement, straightforward teaching of real skills to children often results in increased achievement and in enhanced self-esteem and enhances self-esteem. Help the child cope through where self-esteem is often increased when the child faces a problem, and try to cope with it rather than avoid it. And that brings us back to where emotion coaching, emotion dismissing parents, where you always allow the child to show emotions, and that probably can be channeled in such a way, helping children maybe find new coping strategies, and rather than avoiding strategies or ways of coping. So as we turn our attention under the self, let's look at self-efficacy, which is the belief that one can master a situation and produce favorable outcomes. During middle childhood, children develop a sensitivity to feelings to the feelings of others, where self-regulation is the ability to manage negative emotions and threaten self-development. So coping and problem solving increases during this period, and research actually shows that girls with poor self-regulation would freeze with anxiety, whereas boys with poor self-regulation tend to lash out. So you're seeing gender socialization plays an important role in understanding self-regulation and how boys versus girls actually cope with different situations and how they're able to regulate their emotions. Children raised in institutions tend to generally have poor self-regulation. So just looking at the emotional developmental part, developmental changes in emotions during this period of childhood actually include the following, where one, improved emotional understanding, where when you look at children in primary school develop an increased ability to understand complex emotions such as pride, feeling ashamed, and these emotions become, of course, less tied to the reactions of other people and become more self-generated and integrated with a sense of personal responsibility. Second, when you look at in terms of the changes in emotions during childhood, another one, increased understanding that more than one emotion can be experienced in a particular situation. For instance, you might see a 9-year-old, 10-year-old child may understand that achieving something might involve both anxiety and joy. So, in third, increased awareness of events leading to emotional reactions, whereby a 10-year-old child in this stage becomes aware that her sadness today may be influenced by her friend moving to another town maybe last week. Fourth, in terms of the ability, there's that ability to suppress or conceal negative emotional reactions. You can see maybe during that age phase of development, maybe you see an 11-year-old child has learned to tone down her anger because better than even before. Even when one of her classmates irritates her, she has learned that way to control her emotions. The use of self-initiated strategies for redirected feelings, whereby children become more reflective about their emotional lives and increasingly use strategies to control their emotions. They can manage their emotions, soothing themselves after an upset. Finally, a capacity for genuine empathy. You can see that you can even see it with maybe 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds, where a child feels sympathy for a distressed person and experiences vicariously the sadness the distressed person is feeling. So as we close this section, one of the things you would want to understand is coping with stress. And an important aspect in children's emotions, in their emotional lives, is actually learning how to cope with stress. As children get older, they more accurately appraise a stressful situation and determine how much control they have over it. By 10 years of age, most children are able to use cognitive strategies to cope with stress. However, in families that have not been supportive and are characterized by turmoil or trauma, children may be overwhelmed by stress that do not use such strategies. Okay, so that takes us to the end of socio-emotional development and the end of lecture 7, middle and late childhood. We've learned a lot of concepts here, from partly in cognitive development, some of physical development, what is happening as the children grows in terms of fine motor skills, gross motor skills, but very importantly, going back to the work of Piaget in terms of the concrete operational stage. I need you all to pay attention to several different principles that were highlighted in this lecture. The whole concept of horizontal decalage, and in socio-emotional, looking at the self, ways of coping, emotional development, and self-regulation. So that takes us to the end of the lecture. Do have a blessed evening, and hope to see you next week as we continue adolescent development. Thank you, and do enjoy the rest of your week.